She thought it was just another day in court, until she saw his face. Shackled, broken, familiar. The man on trial for robbery wasn't a stranger. He was the boy she once loved. And now, she's the judge who might send him to prison. What happens when justice comes face to face with a buried past? The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Rebecca Langley sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case. At least that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case, the State of Louisiana versus Malcolm Carter. Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the ERS in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, her world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was Malcolm Carter, her Malcolm. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they made as kids to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Rebecca's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. Malcolm looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Rebecca forced herself to speak. "Mr. Carter, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Malcolm's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Rebecca's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was Malcolm, and somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as her mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and Malcolm had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while Malcolm's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met, an accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. Malcolm had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help, and that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Rebecca," he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But Malcolm wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was. A place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school, when Rebecca's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Rebecca, get inside, now." She'd hesitated, glancing at Malcolm, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near Malcolm, and soon after, Malcolm's family moved away. Rebecca threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Hammond. And she went to law school chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of Malcolm after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you really see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. Malcolm was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries and the cash register had been emptied. Malcolm was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Rebecca studied Malcolm as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant Eliza Morgan approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Langley, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Eliza asked. Rebecca hesitated. Should she confide in Eliza? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she'd buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Stephen Grant, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grant began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register. The evidence will show that Malcolm Carter is guilty of this crime." Rebecca felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if Malcolm were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at Malcolm, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Jasmine Cole, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, Malcolm Carter, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, a store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting Malcolm's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Jasmine's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Brian Scott, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark and he had the hood up." Jasmine nodded, pacing slightly. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," Jasmine said, cutting him off. Rebecca noticed Malcolm shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring, as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was Malcolm, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Rebecca studied it intently. Could this truly be Malcolm? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. Malcolm's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Jasmine argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate Malcolm's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism. As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Rebecca lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to Malcolm, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. As she watched Malcolm being escorted out of the room in shackles, Rebecca's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth, but for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Jasmine Cole called her first key witness, Officer Frank Mitchell, the arresting officer. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Mitchell, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Jasmine approached him with deliberate calm. "Officer Mitchell," she began, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone clipped. "You stated in your report that Mr. Carter was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Mitchell shifted in his seat. He matched the description, a black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Jasmine's eyebrows raised slightly. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Carter's possession when you searched him? Mitchell hesitated. No, but he could have discarded it. Jasmine took a step closer. Could have. Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie? Mitchell's jaw tightened. No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly. Jasmine pressed on. So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description without physical evidence linking him to the scene. The officer's silence spoke louder than any words. Rebecca's gaze flickered to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances. Jasmine wasn't done. "Officer Mitchell, do you recall if Mr. Carter said anything at the time of his arrest?" "He protested, said he was innocent." "And did you consider investigating his claim, or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance?" Mitchell's face reddened. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Jasmine repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed again as Mitchell stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was more than just a trial now. It was a reckoning, not just for Malcolm, but for a system that seemed too eager to condemn him. The defense's next move was unexpected. Jasmine introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there was no definitive way to confirm it was Malcolm. Furthermore, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising questions about its reliability. The prosecutor attempted to dismiss the testimony as conjecture, but the jury appeared unsettled. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Rebecca could feel its weight. As the day drew to a close, Malcolm was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Jasmine had warned him of the risks, but Malcolm insisted. He stood, chains clinking softly as he approached the stand. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity. "I've made mistakes in my life," Malcolm began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night I was walking home minding my own business when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions, they just decided I fit the bill." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this, I'm tired, I just want the truth to matter." Rebecca's throat tightened as Malcolm sat back down. His words hung in the air, a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of emotions: doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Rebecca knew that her role wasn't just to uphold the law. It was to interpret it in a way that served true justice. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The closing arguments were delivered with precision. The prosecutor leaned on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system's process. Jasmine, however, pleaded for the jury to see beyond the surface, to consider the holes in the case and the human of the man on trial. Rebecca listened intently, her face impassive, but her mind racing. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice weighed heavily on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs or whispered among themselves. Malcolm sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Rebecca since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she possibly say to make any of this better? Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Malcolm Carter, we find the defendant, the pause was unbearable, not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Rebecca tapped her gavel, restoring order. Malcolm's shoulders sagged as if a weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory came at a cost. Rebecca addressed the court, her voice steady. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca lingered behind, watching Malcolm as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now, just a few clerks tidying up and Eliza Morgan gathering files. Malcolm stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything?" "You knew me." Rebecca felt her throat tighten, the words catching. "Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I'd said something, it might have jeopardized the case." Malcolm studied her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he repeated. "That's the thing, Eleanor. The world's never been fair. Not for people like me." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." Malcolm sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Rebecca said, her voice firm. "And I'm sorry." Malcolm gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Rebecca sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. For Rebecca, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position wasn't just a seat of power, but a platform for change. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Rebecca made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to Malcolm and to herself to try.